Hey everybody. Welcome. Give it a few minutes to let everybody have some time to arrive. And I'm going to move my panelist questions screen because I still not seeing it. There we go. That's very strange.
Can you still not see the Q&A, Sophie?
Yeah, it will not hover over my slide deck. So it's hidden in another view of my desktop, which is interesting. But you can still see my screen right now, right?
Yes.
Okay, then I can refer back to it, so that'll work. I'll just give it a few minutes. Dan, how's the climate where you're at right now in the New York, New Jersey area? Is it hot, humid?
It is typical for this time of year, which is humid, somewhere between 85 to 95, depending on the day. For our British friends, think it's pretty much in the low 30s every day here, maybe high 30s, depending on what's going on.
Did your brain start to think in Celsius now that you've lived there long enough?
My brain thinks on simultaneously on both sides of the Atlantic, hence my background.
Okay. Wonderful.
The problem is I sometimes can't remember what is a British term and what is an American term anymore. And I'll talk about football or soccer and switch back and forth between away matches and road games. Right?
Oh, funny. Yeah. There's all these subtle differences.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, let's go ahead and get started. We're excited to have you here with us today. All right. So welcome to this webinar for UK to US founders making the leap to grow their startups. I'm Sophie Alcorn. I'm here with Dan Glazer, and I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca to read our lawyer disclaimers before we go ahead and get started.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our presentation today. I have a few housekeeping items before we get started. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording link will be available to you. This presentation is an educational service by Alcorn Immigration Law, and the information discussed should not be construed as legal advice for any specific action and is an overview only. Please be sure to consult a knowledgeable professional for assistance with your particular issue. Lastly, please submit any questions you may have by using Zoom's Q&A function and do so anonymously. These questions are shared publicly, so please do not share any sensitive or personal information. It's now my pleasure to introduce you to our founder and CEO, Sophie Alcorn.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Sophie Alcorn. I'm the founder of Alcorn Immigration Law and the host of the Sophie Alcorn podcast, where I've had the pleasure of interviewing my colleague, Dan Glazer, in the past. I've written for TechCrunch for 4 years. I wrote a best-selling immigration book called Ask Sophie, The Founder's Guide to Visas and Green Cards. I'm a mom. I like to meditate, and I think the world should be a place where every person can grow up and have the opportunity to be in the place where they can work in their flow state and live abundantly and contribute to making the world a better place. And when we can all do that, the world will be an amazing place to live. And so one of the reasons I like practicing immigration law for startup founders is to help remove those barriers that would prevent people from being able to self-actualize and live their dreams. And it's my pleasure to introduce the illustrious Dan Glazer. He is God, what did you call yourself? A warrior making sure that UK startups are safe in the world.
Making the world safe for British startups.
Making the world safe for British startups. I love it. I love it. Dan is well known in international startup circles and business circles for establishing the London office of Wilson Sonsini. And why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, Dan?
Sure thing. Thanks, Sophie. Great to be here today. So I head up the London office and the U.S. expansion team at the Silicon Valley headquartered law firm Wilson Sonsini. And so Wilson was one of the first law firms in Silicon Valley to work with tech companies back in the early 60s when the first venture funds were formed to invest in tech companies. And our model has always been to work with sort of garage stage startups, as it were, and then scale with them up to IPO and then beyond as a public company. So in London, I head up a team of about 45 US and dual qualified UK US corporate tech lawyers. So it's an American British blended team in London that works with UK and European startups through their US life cycle: launch, scale, raise money, exit through M&A or IPO in the United States.
Amazing. How did you get the idea to start this office?
So all credit is due actually to the UK government's economic development organization, what was then called UK Trade and Investment, and today is called the UK Department for Business and Trade. About I guess almost 15 years ago. I'm an expat New Yorker, although technically I guess I'm from the borough of New Jersey, so I have to be open about that. But always worked in New York. And then I took a meeting with the UK government's economic development organization in early 2011 when they explained to me the UK government, I guess it was the Cameron government at the time, their Tech City initiative, which was their initiative to help scale the digital economy in the UK. And as they said, historically, they'd seen a lot of American tech companies look at the United Kingdom. Going forward, they were expecting to see a lot more UK tech companies look at accessing the US commercial and capital markets. And as they said, it'd be great to think about how to help them. And if you could do it on the ground in London, Dan, that would be brilliant. So as they say, challenge accepted, and sort of the rest is history.
Amazing, amazing. Well, I'm really looking forward to having this opportunity to chat with you about all the latest considerations for British startups looking to expand to the US. So I have some slides, but I will be just hopping through these so that we can get to the conversation. But I want to lay the groundwork from an immigration perspective. So, just a little bit about me. This is my law firm. We just hired 2 new lawyers. We still need their headshots, but we're a remote, decentralized law firm. I'm based in Silicon Valley. I believe that people who are listening to this webinar today and who will be listening to the recording are at some intersection of, maybe having ESTA or maybe having a B1, B2 visitor visa. Maybe some have already had a work visa in the past in the US, and they're probably drawn to this content to look at the possibilities for personally immigrating as a founder to the US for market expansion, raising subsequent rounds of venture capital funding, being able to scale in the US market. And sometimes people also want to look at bringing over sales engineers or hiring immigrants in the United States. So there's a lot of these moments for early stage startups where immigration can come into the picture. And it really depends on the product, the level of technical detail, if it's B2B or B2C, all of those factors play into it. But anyway, lots of reasons people want to come here. For most people listening, it's going to be localizing and finding product market channel fit in the US, which might be different than in the UK or other possible countries where they've been growing, and then being able to go to market here and raise subsequent rounds of venture capital funding. So I'll just say a few words about visas and green cards to set the stage. First of all, you do not need a visa to get a green card in the US. The green card is permanent residence, but as a green card can often take 2 to 4 years or even longer if you're from India or China. Most individuals end up wanting to come here on a work visa because that's usually more of a 4 to 6 month timeline, which is good for business. And I just want to state that a lot of people have imposter syndrome when it comes to U.S. immigration, because you've heard that you have to be, super extraordinary to come here. But I just want to reiterate that US immigration law does not necessarily care about your education. So if you never went to college, it can still work. They don't know necessarily about the stages of a startup. So if you don't have an MVP yet, or funding, or product market fit, you could still potentially come here just fine. And you certainly do not need to be a unicorn startup or have IPO'd or have gotten a Nobel Prize or anything to come here. So some myth busting. One of the most popular visa types right now is the O-1 visa for extraordinary ability. We can file it with an agent so that you can have a variety of streams of income while you're here. You don't have to just work for one company. It's also a good foundation to set the stage for the EB-1A green card down the road, which is the fastest green card pathway. And as I mentioned, you can be a founder, you can have a part-time job, you can get advisory shares in other people's startups, you could get paid to speak from the stage, you can be a contractor or consultant. So if you're still bootstrapping, it's nice to have an O-1 because you can self-fund in a variety of ways. There's a variety of categories. You need 3 out of the 8. A lot of the companies that we work with coming out of the UK have already raised a seed round or a Series A in the UK, or in Europe more broadly, and so they would often qualify for a variety of these O-1 criteria, such as the venture capital is considered an award. There might be some publicity in the United Kingdom. Maybe there's some IP protections that you are starting there. You would already have a leading role in a distinguished organization. You might be part of some founder groups, which are hard to get into. And there might be evaluation to your equity already if you went through a price round. So, that alone is like 5 of the 8 criteria. So there's a lot of ways to work with that. And we can get these not just for founders, but even, for TikTok influencers. So you can mix and match the categories in many ways. Another common visa is the E-1, E-2. If your US company is majority owned by UK citizens and you're a UK citizen, it's lovely because you could hire any UK citizen if they have skills that are essential to your business without them ever having worked for you. But at the point you're doing a Delaware flip and maybe there's dilution, once your company becomes less than 50% UK owned, that could invalidate these visas. So less common, but maybe there's some AI companies bootstrapping and they don't need to raise, right? So, this is just one thing to know about. The L-1 is very popular and common. It's great if you already have 5 to 10 employees in the UK. And it's especially great if you're married and your spouse needs an unlimited work permit in the US. This visa offers that. It's good for up to 7 years. You can even use it to open a new US office. And if you go through the Delaware flip after you have this visa, the visa will remain intact. So it can be very valuable. Another thing that just happened is the government is breathing new life into international entrepreneur parole. It is a option for founders to come to the US for 2.5 years for their spouses to work. There's an opportunity for a 2.5-year extension. And all we have to show is that your US company was incorporated less than 5 years ago, and you've received at least, they're adjusting the amounts for inflation. So these are the October 1st numbers, but $312,000 from US investors or $125,000 from US government grants, state, federal, local, regional, and that you have equity in the company, and up to 3 people from the company can qualify as founders. So the government just announced that the backlogs have been cleared and they're excited to adjudicate these cases as expeditiously as possible. So this is a new thing that I'm really excited is now ready to go and help a lot of people, because then if you're in stealth mode, you don't have to mess around with trying to become famous when all you want to do is build your product. If you got funding in the UK, we could try to go for this, but ideally you would have at least like 1 angel investor in the US so that we can show that some of your funding is from the US, and then we can argue that you partially meet the requirements and that there's other good reasons for the government to let you in. So that one's pretty exciting. Now for green cards, lots of pathways up the green card mountain. Marry an American, there's a green card lottery, there's employment-based green cards. Many companies sponsor these. But for our purposes, the EB-1A for extraordinary ability and the EB-2 NIW are best for founders because you can self-petition. The EB-1A, very similar to the O-1A. It has premium processing. There's no backlog right now for people born in the United Kingdom. So it's the fastest. You could probably get a green card in 1 to 2 years through this pathway. Variety of criteria. Like the O-1, we have to show that you meet 3 out of the, in this case, 10 criteria, and that you've demonstrated sustained national or international acclaim. So often getting an O-1 first is a great stepping stone. But the other easier option is the national interest waiver green card. You don't have to be extraordinary. You can just be exceptional or have a master's degree or a bachelor's plus 5 years of progressive experience. And then we have to show why your startup is good for America. And we can do that in a variety of ways. And this is also a powerful green card pathway, although it can take about 1.5 years longer than the EB-1A right now for people born in the United Kingdom. So now I'm so excited to welcome Dan into the conversation. And we've had multiple conversations over the years, and I'm excited to hear both the lay of the land, you know, traditionally, but also some of the latest updates. So let's focus this conversation as, you know, pretend there's a UK startup founder in the room. They've raised some initial investment, and now they feel like they need to start thinking about the US. What are the primary reasons that a founder would be thinking about US expansion when they come to you?
Yeah, no, typically it's the size of the commercial market, commercial and customer market in the United States, and it's the access to venture capital.
Yeah.
That the size of the venture capital market and kind of the nature of venture capital in the US is a little bit different than it is in the UK and Europe, right? I mean, you've got funds in the United States, especially in Silicon Valley in New York, that for generations have built some of the most valuable, backed and then helped build some of the most valuable startups and scale-ups in the world, and getting to access, you know, that funding, that experience, that talent at the investor level is that's a real driver.
Because it's not just about the money, right? Money's kind of a commodity in the whole picture. It's also really what doors the VC will open for you. Now VCs are like fighting for their clients at a regulatory and policy level in Washington through lobbying. So that can be really powerful, right?
Yeah, I mean that you know a really great venture capital fund, especially one that's, let's say, multi-stage, sizable fund, can help in a range of different ways. I mean, there's the it may have a platform of resources where it can help, as you said, can even help lobby for the companies, or help introduce them to additional talent and executives to bring into the companies, and help make introductions to customers, right? And obviously bring to bear the experience from other companies of, you know, how, and engage in a bit of pattern matching, right? That, you know, these companies over here that succeeded did it this way, you may want to think about also doing it this way. But there's also a couple other things going on, which is, I mean, the signaling effect is real, right? That if you take you know, if you're backed by, let's say, a tier 1 US fund, it makes it that much easier to recruit tier 1 US talent. Because in the US, more than arguably any other ecosystem in the world, that the employees are motivated, at least in part, by the potential value of options, right? Of those employees' ownership, potential ownership stakes in the companies. And for generations of startups, there have been stories of employees at the M&A or IPO exit doing very, very well. You know, on after those exit events.
One of the reasons to be involved in startups in the first place is that
right?
ticket, that lottery ticket.
And it's funny that you say that. I've actually spoken with a British CEO who, in their experience with hiring employees, he said, I've never really seen anything like this. That American startup employees, to an extent that this individual had never seen anywhere else in the world, he said they are playing, quote, lottery tickets, end quote, when they're joining startups, and that it's the massive upside that is
Right.
a real potential driver
Yeah,
of
it's
doing
not
better.
about if they're making, 160K versus 225K. That really is not the driver. You can live
And
on any of it.
right, right. And what happens is, right, if you as a company are backed by investors that have a track record of working with companies who have that,
Mm.
high end level of success, that makes it easier to recruit top talent because you can credibly say, listen, you know, these options are a lottery ticket, but the lottery ticket has better odds
Yeah,
if you join us
right.
because we are backed by this fund, right? And
Oh,
there's also, sorry, go on.
oh, no, please continue. And then I have another question for you.
And I think the final point I make is just risk appetite. Um,
Mhm.
is that, and I'm just going to channel things that have been what I'm about to say is channeling something that I think gets said a lot, especially in Silicon Valley, which is that to some extent, a lot of the funds, especially on the West Coast, are sort of running science experiments. And they sort of, kind of expect that there's going to be a number of failures in the portfolio, but that the successes are going to be so big that on balance, the fund will be successful.
Right.
And that willingness to accept failure in the pursuit of massive success or success at scale is a level of risk tolerance that you don't see, certainly at the scale of risk tolerance that you see in Silicon Valley in particular. You don't necessarily see that in many other tech hubs around the world. And um, for ambitious startup founders who, as they say, are looking to change the world, uh, you know, being able to raise money from funds that have the risk tolerance to back those founders that want to
Mhm.
change the world is a great match.
And it can kind of cut both ways. I think founders, if it's their first rodeo, should let go of the notion that a venture capital firm is some sort of like nurturing place. Like, yes, angel investors can be great. Certain VCs provide a lot of, added services. But at some point, they're going to be looking at their portfolio. They're going to pick the two winners. And then you might not be part of the group that moves forward, essentially. So, be prepared for that as well, because it is very pure capitalism.
Yeah, no, and that's I do think that you're right, that sometimes gets obscured.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, not every company is a great candidate for
Right.
venture capital, right?
And
Um,
if you can make your way to Silicon Valley to be part of this science experiment, people are very forgiving for your, second and third rodeo. They're like, oh, he got funded and he failed before. Great. He knows what he's doing better now. Let's let him do it again.
right.
So you can keep going. Whereas in
Right.
other countries, that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, and that failure in the US, as long as you're learning through your failures, is not
Right.
seen, at least in the startup ecosystem, is not seen as a as
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
as a black mark against you. Let's say in the same way that it
Right.
might be in other geographies.
How has
Um,
the market for early stage funding changed over the last couple of years in the UK? Because, a few years ago when we first started chatting in the ZERP interest rate era, it
hmm,
was you just two got a sales founder, got an engineering founder, got a pitch deck, get 5 million or 10 million and no MVP needed. And now I see a very different thing here, which is how much traction do you have? How many paying
yeah.
customers? What's your growth rate? So is it similar in the UK right now?
Yeah, I think what we've seen is, a real peak of activity, let's say in 2020 and 2021, and then sort of a valley in part of 22 and into 23. I think things have normalized a bit now, but what I do think is pretty clear is that whether it's seed or A, and even up the stack, but especially let's talk about seed and A for a minute, is that what we're seeing is that there seems to be plenty of money available, including from American investors, right? Um,
Hmm.
that typically, if you can show some sort of US story coming out of the UK, maybe management on the ground in the United States, or traction in the United States among users or customers, or maybe experience at the management level, building and scaling or raising in the US previously. In other words, what I think of as a US story, or you are just materially better than homegrown American alternatives that actually early stage American investors in those circumstances will look overseas, to at least some will, to the UK and to Europe. But the bar is higher than it used to be able to raise. In other words, the money is there, but it's really, the level of discipline you have to have as a company, the level of success you have to have as a company, the level of potential you have to have as a company, I think is there's a little bit, just a little bit more rigor, I
Does
would
that mean
say,
there's
being
still a
applied.
lot of dry powder just hanging out waiting to be invested?
Yeah, what I would say is that we are not seeing companies, let's say, that really should be funded fail to get funded.
Okay.
Whereas I do think in, let's say, the second half of 22 into 23, even for great companies, it was
Yeah.
a bit of a struggle.
Okay, so things are improving.
Yeah, and whereas now companies that really should get funded, great teams, large TAM, real superstars, like they're able to get robust processes going, with multiple suitors
Got
to
it.
come in a way that, let's say, a year and a half ago would have been more of a struggle. But again, this is not necessarily 2021 where, not to be flippant about it, but let's just say it was a little easier on
A lot
balance,
easier. Yeah.
right? To raise money. There's a fair bit of rigor being applied now. And look, I think that there's a lot more of a focus, let's say, on what the eventual exit's going to look like. I mean, one of the things that's been noticeable, especially in the UK and Europe, is how much money has been invested over the years. I mean, to give you a sense of it, I'll give you an example. In 2010, the year of the Tech City launch in London, or in the UK rather, there was $100 million total invested into London tech companies. And the high watermark in 2021, there was roughly 20 to 25 billion invested into London tech companies. Right? I
Wow.
mean, massive amounts of money have come in. And there are similar numbers, maybe not at the same scale, but similar numbers directionally that you'll see around the major tech centers in Europe. But what you haven't necessarily seen is, large unicorn exits, or even kind of 500 million and above exits at scale, right? Large
Yeah.
M&A sales, large IPOs at scale.
Why do you
And
think that
so
is?
I think there's
Just
a,
not enough time has passed?
well,
Or
I
the
think that's part of it. I think that is part of it. And I think that you look at the statistics, and the average company was what, like 11, 12, may even be more at this point, but 11 to 12 years from incorporation to IPO.
Wow.
Actually, it's probably a little bit longer now, given the relative tech IPO drought of the past few years, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, you think about how that lines up from a timing standpoint. Well, if you go back to what I said about the numbers, the investment numbers right after the Tech City launch, $100 million total invested into the London tech ecosystem. That's basically a standing start. And so the real company building didn't begin in earnest, and the real funding didn't really begin in earnest until you got, further into the 2010s. You
Okay.
add 11, 12, 13 years, and actually that's not so surprising, perhaps, that we haven't necessarily seen a ton of exits.
You're on track. And there's also been a lot of US VCs that are opening London offices, right? There's been a lot of growth with that.
Yeah, so we've done a bit of an unofficial count. So this is not official government numbers here, but at our count, there's a roughly 60 or so, about five dozen funds now that are proper transatlantic, that have offices in the US, usually in either New York or Silicon Valley, or the Bay Area generally, on the one hand, and have offices in the UK or elsewhere in Europe on the other. And disproportionately, those funds are in London.
Okay.
Right. When I say the UK and Europe, of those 60 or so, roughly 60, I probably at the 80% level, it's probably London.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
That
Okay.
what we've seen is that London London is to continental Europe a little bit what Silicon Valley is to the rest of the United States when it comes to
Mhm.
tech. That there are, several outstanding tech hubs in the United States,
Right.
but by most, if not all metrics, Silicon Valley or the Bay Area generally kind of sits above, and especially disproportionately as the source of funding. You
Mhm.
pretty much see the same thing in the metrics when you look at London compared to the other hubs like an Amsterdam, a Berlin, a Paris, a Stockholm, great, Dublin, great hubs,
Right.
but London kind of is a slight notch above when it comes to the amount of funding, and other metrics that you might measure the size of the ecosystem, and you actually see that in the startup genome startup ecosystem report that comes out every year. I think for the last 4 years straight, the number one ecosystem globally has been Silicon Valley, but the tied number two, or joint number two, as we might say in the UK, joint number two has been London and New York for each of the past 4 years.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Wow. And if you're a UK founder with a US story and you are able to raise money from US uh, firms in London, at what point would they want you to begin your US market expansion, or would they encourage you to raise subsequent rounds of capital from the US directly?
So let me unpack that a little bit. So what we do see is that there's a distinction between the American funds that do have offices in the UK and Europe and the American funds that do not have offices in
Oh,
the UK and Europe.
okay.
The ones that do have people on the ground in the UK and Europe tend to, on average, come in a bit earlier into the
Mm-hmm.
companies, right? Into UK-based and European-based companies because they've got people on the ground, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it's a little bit easier for them to get comfortable, going to the board meetings, working on a day-to-day basis with the company. You can do that a lot easier when you're based in London, even if the company's based in like Paris or Amsterdam or right, Berlin. It's relative to the fund is based
Yeah.
in San Francisco and the founders, are in the management team are based in Berlin.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
that's tougher. So it is a bit easier. And then, the other dynamic difference that we see is that the funds that have offices in the UK and Europe are materially less likely to require the company to be as we say, a Delaware topco, right?
Yeah.
A Delaware parent company in
Yeah.
order to receive the funding, whereas at least at seed and Series A, it is much more common for a US only fund
Yeah.
to require that corporate structure. So
But
there
there's a
really, I
lot
mean,
of
there is a difference.
if you're a UK topco, the British government will give you a lot of benefits as a startup, right? Like I don't know if there's investment, but seems like there's tax incentives.
There's a range of incentives,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That there are, R&D tax credits.
Mm-hmm.
There's the so-called EMI scheme. That would be scheme in the British English sense, not in the pyramid scheme sense. But the EMI program, I'll use the American, the EMI program in the UK, which provides tax advantaged options to UK employees. Probably the most well known, at least in the UK, is the so-called SEIS or EIS
Mm.
tax breaks. In other words, SEIS stands for the Seed Enterprise Investment Scheme.
Oh,
Again, scheme in
okay.
the program sense. And
Yeah.
the EIS is the Enterprise Investment Scheme for slightly later stage companies. And in short, what that does is it provides UK tax breaks to UK investors who are investing into UK companies.
I see.
And now, the interesting thing though is that you can generally save these tax treatments even if you end up, as they say, flipping into a Delaware parent.
Oh, that's really good to know.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now you do need to carefully work with HMRC, right?
Mhm.
In other words, the
Mhm.
UK tax authorities on
Mhm.
this. But
Mhm.
but it's not an automatic loss of all benefits. Like for example, the R&D tax credits. Generally, if you do keep the R&D still in the UK,
Mhm.
even if you have a Delaware parent company, right, then it still often is possible to
Right.
maintain your tax credits. With the EMI scheme, the EMI program, we all the time see companies that flip into a Delaware parent company but still retain EMI treatment for the options provided to UK employees. I mean, it takes some tax planning, but you can absolutely do it.
Yeah.
But I think maybe in my experience, the most surprising one
Mm-hmm.
is that it is possible to save EIS and SEIS treatment for UK investors, let's say existing UK investors who have already put money in, and then like the next round, the company raises from American investors, and the American investors insist on the so-called Delaware flip. Well, what happens to the UK investors who have got a 3-year period where they can claim tax relief? But now they have money going into it. They have they're shareholders of a U.S. parent company, a Delaware parent company. And I talk to companies about this all the time, and I often kind of muse. I'm like, I don't think that the UK tax authorities intended to provide UK taxpayers with UK tax breaks for investing into Delaware companies.
Yeah.
But what you end up doing is you end up creating what's called a permanent establishment of the Delaware company in the UK, and sort of in layman's terms, what it means is that you modify the operational setup of the Delaware holding company so that it becomes tax resident in the UK.
That's interesting. I've only heard about people saying, "Oh, you want to avoid accidentally becoming a permanent establishment," but of course, it's just a status, so it's got to be useful in certain situations.
Yeah, no, and you're right. I mean, for example, and this is probably previewing another question, which is when a UK company is expanding to the United States, the bright red line of typically when they would create a Delaware subsidiary company owned by the UK company is typically when they would hire US employees, or as you know, move those employees or management to the US through a visa, right? That one way or the other, whether they are HQ employees or whether they are new US hires, for, as you said, as you noted, permanent establishment reasons, you would not want to hire those individuals through a UK parent company. You would want to hire those individuals, employ those individuals through a US and specifically Delaware subsidiary. And that makes sure that you're shielding the UK parent company, which is sort of the deep pockets of the operation, from the potential tax and liability issues associated with having a permanent establishment of the UK company in the United States. So yeah, so usually, as you alluded to, you're trying to avoid creating a permanent establishment, but when you have already provided existing investors with SEIS or EIS tax breaks, and you have a later stage US fund insisting on a Delaware flip, how do you navigate this so you keep everybody happy? You flip into Delaware to satisfy the needs of the incoming US investor, but then you create that permanent establishment and get HMRC approval to maintain a SEIS EIS treatment to satisfy the existing UK investors.
When it's like really early stage, let's say it's like an enterprise SaaS company headquartered in the UK, and they don't have any employees in the US yet, and they're not ready to do immigration yet, but they have some US customers. Is there any issue when the US customers, Stripe payments are going into the UK company bank account? I mean, I think I see that all the time, and I'm always curious I guess you can take payments from anybody in the world.
So legally, there is no issue, let's say, with being a SaaS company, a UK-based, UK limited SaaS company, and selling remotely, either through an English law commercial contract or, frankly, a contract governed by the laws of a US state, right? Either one is fine, and you don't, from a legal standpoint, generally need to have a US company for that. There are some limited exceptions. Some branches of the US government actually mandate contracting with the US entity, right? But certainly in the private sector, what we would more typically run into is the following, right? That let's say, as a matter of policy, of internal corporate policy, the US customer might say, we're only willing to enter into contracts with US companies, but that's not a legal requirement. That is That is
Oh,
a policy requirement. It's an internal corporate policy requirement. And in
okay.
other words, it's a company specific decision that may have been made by a particular US company
Oh,
or
or
US
something.
customer that says, just for matter of principle, basically, they just don't
Mm,
want to be contracting directly with
hmm,
non-US
okay.
entities, right?
Okay.
Now, you mentioned the issue about Stripe. I mean, yeah, one of the things we've also seen is that some of the payment providers and companies that are facilitating cross-border payments either prefer or mandate having a US company to process
Um,
certain payments. But again, that's a contractual requirement of
yeah.
those specific companies as opposed to a legal requirement.
Wow. And we're going to talk more about the US expansion, but I was just curious if anything we've talked about so far is different for AI companies, since that's just such a hot topic right now. But I mean, from a legal perspective and finance, it's the same concept, right?
Yeah, although what I would highlight is the AI companies and other deep tech companies that are working on sort of sensitive technologies should
Mhm.
be aware of the national security regimes
Yeah.
that the UK and the US governments have put in
So
place.
that's like ITAR and like
Well,
export
that
controls in the
that
US.
too. Yeah, so
Oh,
that so ITAR and export control issues arise when you start transferring technology across borders,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But there's another issue that even if you don't transfer the technology across borders, let's say that if you're a UK AI company and you're taking money in from a non-UK investor, you very well may end up coming within in the purview of the relatively recently enacted National Security Investment Act, right? And the
Yeah.
National Security Investment Act, it allows the UK government to take a look at and evaluate non-UK investment or acquisition, into UK businesses.
Is that
And
like
it's
CFIUS in the
and
US?
that's exactly what I was about to say.
Okay.
It is analogous to a much older set of rules in the US called the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS, right? And CFIUS is analogous, right? So what CFIUS is saying is that if you're a US business and you receive investment or an acquisition by a non-US entity, then they may end up taking a close look at that, right?
Yeah, and they could even like insist that you change your board membership to have more Americans. There's a variety of things that could come
Or
out of
even unwind the transaction, or either prohibit it in advance, or if it's
yeah.
afterwards, unwind it in sort of a worst case scenario. So
Wow.
that's an analysis that is done now as sort of best practices diligence in the context of an acquisition or a fundraise that has a cross-border aspect to it.
Wow. Okay. Um, so let's say somebody's ready to make the move. They don't need to do the Delaware. Well, actually, no, this is a good question for
Hmm,
you. What are some of the factors that would affect whether a startup needs a like a wholly owned subsidiary in the
hmm,
US versus doing the Delaware flip?
sure. Great question. Um, the way I usually summarize it is as follows. To the extent that the UK company needs to have a separate US company, I'm going to pause there. I'm phrasing that way for a very specific reason. To the extent that a
Mm,
US company is needed.
okay.
Because as you and I just discussed, let's say that you're a SaaS company selling remotely into the US. You may not need a US company at all,
Yeah.
right?
If you just have some contractors, you might not
Or
need.
that's another one. If you're just hiring contractors, you can hire the contractors through a UK company. That's not a
Yeah.
problem at all, right? So to the extent that a
Okay.
US company is required, pretty much everything that you want to do in the US, certainly in the private sector, the government starts to get a little more complicated, but certainly in the private sector, um, anything that you want to do in the US, you generally can do through a wholly owned subsidiary, usually a Delaware subsidiary of the UK limited company, with one exception. And the exception is that you raise money from US based funds who say we will invest in you, but we are not willing to invest in a corporate structure that you have unless it has a Delaware corporation at the top, right?
And those funds don't have to do that. I don't know if they have to do that legally, but I know just a lot of them, as a matter of policy at their formation, put that into the structuring documents of the fund. It's like, must be Delaware corporation.
There's different reasons, right? And different funds have different reasons for it. And I'll list off some of the reasons why a U.S. fund might insist on a Delaware flip. One reason is tax. You know, QSBS treatment, qualified small business stock tax treatment, does not apply to UK limited companies. So if you have a Delaware corporation, QSBS is a possibility. Now, the extent to which that's really does move the needle in a given transaction is sort of a case by case analysis, right? You're not going to necessarily get any QSBS benefit in all instances, but in some instances, it's absolutely a consideration, right? That's one thing. Second, another reason is that, and I think you alluded to this, some U.S. funds do have in their LP documents a restriction that says the fund may only invest in U.S.-based companies. And at that point, there's nothing to argue about. Like, it's just a contractual block on being able to invest in anything other than a U.S. company, usually what they mean is a Delaware company. Another reason might be simply they don't want to bother, right? Is that, the
deal flow.
that the earlier stage that the company is, especially for the early stage seed funds, that they have a very streamlined process for executing on their investments, and that they've got their own investment documents and their form of term sheet, their form of long form documents that they're very happy with. They've probably got legal relationships that they've had, and it's totally streamlined, and it's all optimized for Delaware companies. And if you come in saying, well, I've got this UK limited, and that kind of upsets the apple cart.
Or even Wyoming or Nevada.
Well, that's a whole nother issue. But certainly, right, like if for some early stage funds, they look at this and they say, well, now I got to go find an English solicitor, and I'm in a jurisdiction that I don't really understand, and is this really worth it, given that there's a lot of other seed stage opportunities out there that I could go invest in? How much conviction do I really have relative to the hundreds or even thousands of other U.S. opportunities in front of me? And that's kind of why, when we talk to UK founders about this, we always tell them, look, have the discussion with the VC and keep an open mind about this Delaware flip dynamic, which is, don't assume that you have to do it, but don't assume that you don't have to do it either. And what I mean is that it should be sort of the last part of the discussion. If the first, you need to determine whether the investor is actually willing to invest in the company based on, the operations and the management and the metrics, et cetera. Like, forget the corporate structure. Is the company actually investable? Is it of interest to the U.S. investor? Right? If it is, then you say to the VC, like, look, no, then if you're willing to come in and you like everything about us except for this corporate structure point, and you're willing to give us a term sheet, no problem. We can deal with the Delaware flip issue in the term sheet. And that's usually how it plays out, is that you build the Delaware flip obligation into the term sheet, right? And so between signing of the term sheet and closing of the financing, you end up running two transactions in parallel. You run the flip and the financing. And what that does is it protects both sides. It protects the company in that they don't commit to spending the money on the Delaware flip, because it tends to be a pretty complicated transaction, especially if you've got SEIS or EIS tax treatment that has to be saved.
And plus,
right?
the more just investors, right, that you have, then the more people have to sign off on it. And
right. And so typically what you do, it protects the company to do it that way, building the flip obligation to the term sheet, because then you don't commit to the time and money and effort.
You don't want to spend the money to do it if you don't know that you're getting money.
Exactly, if they're not going to invest. But it also protects the VC, because what's going on is that those two transactions being done in parallel, the flip and the financing, right, is that the financing documents are negotiated contemplating a Delaware company. So you complete the flip first, and then after the flip is completed, then you simply sign the financing documents, and the money comes into the Delaware company. So the US fund never had to deal with the UK limited company.
Oh, that's nice.
Right.
Oh,
So that's how you set it up to sort of satisfy the needs
right,
of
right, right.
both
Wow.
both sides. So those are the different reasons why a US fund would require it.
And then this is like a technical question that probably doesn't really matter too much, but I'm just curious if you've only set up the Delaware corporation for in this example for the flip, but you're not ready to hire people in the US yet.
Mhm.
Do you need to incorporate to do business, or do you need to like register as a foreign company in New York or California, or get a state and local, or like get a local business license in the city, or does that just come into play when you have an office and you have employees?
So that's kind of a state by state question, but I'll tell you
Mhm.
generally what the answer and ends up being. Let's say, for example, if you're just selling remotely from the UK into the US, more often than not, the answer is you may need to register your UK company for sales tax purposes, depending
Oh,
on what the rules are in the local geography and what the extent of your sales are.
yeah.
But legal registration to do business tends to only apply when you either hire employees in that state
Uh-huh.
or set up an office in that
Yeah.
state, like take
Okay.
office space. In other words, establish a presence in that state. So
Yeah. Yeah.
there's a difference, in other words, between legal registration to do business and sort of sales tax registration.
Got it.
Right.
Got it.
And it's very common, let's say, like let's say that you end up having a very successful SaaS company in the United States coming out of the UK, and your sales team is all based, let's say, in New York, sake of argument,
Mhm,
but you're
mhm,
selling all over the US. You end
mhm.
up being a Delaware corporation, let's say that's registered to do business in the state of New York, because that's where all your employees are. But your tax registered, it could be in, a dozen
Excellent.
or more,
California.
it could
Right.
be
Florida.
dozen, 20, whatever. Yeah, different states, depending on the level of sales that you've got in the different states.
So lots and lots of considerations. So interesting. Okay. Um, any differences in working with UK lawyers and US lawyers? Like it's a different culturally, right?
Yeah, well, a lot of it stems from the difference in the litigation system, right?
Oh,
And there's a what seems like a subtle difference in the legal system between the UK and the US that actually has a pretty substantial impact. And that
okay.
is that in the United Kingdom, Sophie, if you and I have had a business dispute in the UK, and we were two UK companies, and we went to court, as a rule, generally loser pays, right? And in other words, loser pays most or all of the winner's legal fees.
Wow.
And that creates a real disincentive to
Yeah.
actually go and litigate, right?
Even if
Because
you think that's 50-50 that you might win, it's not worth it. It has to be like
yeah,
80% you're going to win time, and then
right.
20% times the probability that you're times the dollar amount of funding their defense.
Right. I mean,
Wow.
to quote an old movie, are you feeling lucky? You know? I mean, that's really what it is like, are you really feeling lucky, or because you're going double or nothing? And you see it in the statistics that companies just don't sue that often, relatively speaking, because that's a real disincentive. Because if you lose, you are out, potentially a lot of money.
Yeah.
Um, and so
Not
in
how we do it in the US.
Right. But think about how that the ripple effect that causes. If no one is suing each other and no one's threatening to sue, the role of legal in the US is a little bit different, right? You don't necessarily have to worry so much about the mistakes that you make ending up in litigation.
Oh.
Now,
How
in
do
the United,
people solve their issues in the UK?
there's a lot more sort of business to business discussion. They don't
Negotiate.
necessarily throw everything to the lawyers automatically
Uh,
in the way that you do in the United States, right? Because in the US, of course, if you and I have a business dispute in the US and we go to court,
So,
right? Because, right, as you know, the default rule is that generally each side bears its own costs, even if
Yeah.
they win. And that
Yeah.
means, right, if I'm a disgruntled employee, if I'm an unhappy, commercial counterparty, if I'm an IP owner, if I'm a competitor, right, I can use the litigation system to make the other company's life difficult. Because even if I've only got the slightest chance of winning, if I'm willing to, back up my threats and spend a little bit of money to push the other side into, a realization that they've got two choices: go to court and beat me, expensive, or settle on my terms, also bad, right? They're between a rock and a hard place. So
Wow.
what that leads to is the role of the lawyer in the US very often is problem avoidance. In other words, how do I stay out of these issues in the first place? Help me see around corners. And that leads to America, especially in the tech and the startup sector. I'll bring this back to kind of the core of what we're talking about here, right? What it leads to is that startup lawyers in the US really advise by answering one overarching question, which is, how does the company achieve its business goals while managing risk? Right?
Mm.
Because you can't just focus on just purely managing risk,
If you're just,
certainly as
then
a
you
US
have no time
startup.
to do business because you
Right.
could just manage risk forever.
Because as you and I know, walking across the street in the United States presents some level of risk. I mean, I literally was going into a gym the other day to take a shower and was presented with a liability waiver, right?
Yeah, of course.
Um, and
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 a health form and
right,
emergency contacts and everything.
all of it, right? And so you can't just focus solely on risk, and because then you'd never get anything done. But if you only focus on business goals without keeping one eye on the legal risk in the US, then sooner or later the chances of getting run over by the litigation train in the US are uncomfortably high. So
Mm.
where the magic happens is where, as a legal advisor, you've got both a business hat and a legal hat, and you're exercising judgment to help the company build its business while appropriately managing risk.
Yeah.
The calculus isn't the same in the UK because the litigation risk is so much lower.
Mm. That's really interesting. Thank you, Dan, so much. And we are just about out of time, but can you please share, and we'll provide the recording to everybody who registered, along with how to contact you. But could you also please share a little bit about how folks can get in touch with you?
Sure thing. So I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. So and I'm always happy to, if you want to reach out on LinkedIn, and then also my contact information is on the Wilson Sonsini website, which can be easily found through your favorite search engine or at wsgr.com.
Thank you, Dan. And then just to close out, I will also share for immigration law questions, you're always welcome to reach out to us at alcorn.law or hello@alcorn.law. And then my book is available on Amazon and Audible. Um, Dan, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. I love chatting with you. I think you're brilliant, not just attorney, but business strategist, and your insights into the global venture market and cross border, it's super, super valuable. So thank you so much for being here today and sharing everything with us.
Thanks so much, Sophie. Great to see you today.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Great.
Thank you so much.
You got
Bye-bye.
it. Thank you. Good to see you. Have a great day.
Bye.